Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining Green Tea today. Hope you all had a great summer. I know we took a little break with our green tea sessions, but we are very, very happy to be back, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Anelia Tichkova, and I'm the Program Manager for School and Community Engagement at Oakvillegreen. Before I start my talk, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that in Houghton we are gathering on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Atawandaron, Haudenosaunee, and Métis people. This sacred land surrounding the Great Lakes has been their home and still is for 15,000 years. We acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to share and care for the land and its gifts in accordance with the Dish with One Spoon, One Palm Belt Covenant, a historic peace agreement made among Indigenous nations that commits to take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. We honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, and ancestors that walked before us, and all of the wonderful elements of creation that exist. So a couple of things about myself before I jump into plants and fall maintenance. I do have a background in environmental science and geography, as well as in education. So I love learning and sharing my knowledge. And I recently got my arborist certification just because arboriculture has been always of interest to me. And I find it is both art and science and combines skills with crafts. So it is very important just to have all that knowledge about caring for plants. And it, of course, takes years of experience just to find what works great. I've been always interested in gardening. And for the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years, I'm not even sure, my focus has been a lot on pollinator-friendly and native gardening in my own backyard. When we moved to this place about 12 years ago, there was literally nothing, just a few non-native trees and a vegetable garden and all grass. It took me a lot of work and a lot of experimenting, but I'm very, very proud and happy to be able really to see that I'm creating a habitat in my yard. So most of the photos in this presentation are from my yard, and I do have a few others from local areas in Oakville. A few basic things that always keep in mind, no matter what season it is: plant native when we can. Amazing statistics that even 5% of the plants if they're native, it would support 70% of the caterpillars that would come to this to your garden. So biodiversity in mind, it may be native, but it is really important that we plant a variety of plants, so we support a variety of wildlife. The right plants for the right site, that's very, very tricky, just because we need to consider a lot of factors, not just the sunlight and the moisture, but as well as the soil and if it's a windy site, etc. Focus on the health of your soil. This is a constant. I know the soil is predetermined by the inherited mineral content in the first place, and we struggle with clay soil a lot in Oakville. But there are many ways, sustainable ways, eco-friendly and pollinator-friendly ways that we can focus on the health of the soil. Provide continuous bloom. I know everyone has their favorites, but it is really necessary and important that we consider blooms and food sources throughout the late spring to the late fall seasons. Arrange plants in clusters so that pollinators have an easier time finding them. This is one thing, and the other is that sometimes all these clusters, they support each other. If we have taller plants and we decide just to go with one or two, we would just find very often these plants leaning. When we have clusters of plants, they kind of stick together. So it's much easier. No pesticides and chemicals. Think of the birds as well. We are always prioritizing the beautiful butterflies and bees. They're almost like the symbols of pollination. But think of the birds as well when you're creating and designing your garden. Learn about the life cycles of various pollinators so you can better support their habitats. I will talk about that more later on. And I just forgot to mention, feel free to text, to put your questions and comments in the chat, or just leave them. I will leave some time at the end of my talk so we can try to answer these questions, or just you can share your own experiences. So different perspectives of fall maintenance. And when I started really doing my research, it was really overwhelming. I do that every year. There are a lot of different opinions about fall maintenance, of course. And I try to really consider the various perspectives. Of course, our first thing is ecological perspective. We think of how to support biodiversity and how to support local habitats, how to mimic nature best. So we have, we invite nature in our urban environments. Think conservation and sustainability. We'll talk about leaves a lot today. So how much resources are we using? Are we using them sustainably? Are we trying to conserve them? So just to think and reflect on what your footprint is overall, even when we talk about gardening. Soil science, I mentioned, huge, and it does affect the soil is being affected by what we do, including our fall maintenance. Horticulture and arboriculture. So the horticulture is basically the science that focuses on cultivating plants and caring for plants for human use, where the arboriculture, as I mentioned, it is the study and the practice of caring for individual trees. And of course, aesthetics. This is a huge thing, especially in public parks. We are very much hoping for a mind shift in that perspective. But once again, native plants can be absolutely beautiful. And you can just, or maybe I find them always beautiful, no matter what season it is. But you can do different things. So your garden doesn't look absolutely a mess, like somebody would consider them a mess, but they're gorgeous even in the fall season. So here is my fall maintenance plan, and I've come to, I've done some reading, but of course I came up with that plan throughout the years, what works best and what it doesn't. And once again, having in mind all these different perspectives. So collect and store properly seeds for planting, but leave some for the birds if you're actually doing that. Leave plants uncut for the winter. Leave some leaves in the garden beds and a thin layer on the lawn. And we'll talk about that, each of these items more in detail in a while. Leave some sticks, twigs, logs. They are just a great addition to your garden. Skip the last mow. No leaf blowers and no chemical fertilizers. So we'll start with the seeds. This picture was actually taken at Tannery Park down by the water. And I just love the different, including the seed heads of the black-eyed Susan, contrasting with the asters. I just thought it was beautiful. So collecting seeds, if some of you are actually into seed collection and you love starting seeds, native plants from seed, like me, it is really a great thing to do, and it gives you actually something to do in the winter months and think about plants early in the season. So learn to identify the seeds for each species and collect only mature seeds to ensure they're viable. It is really hard to say, but generally it's 3 to 5 weeks after peak bloom. So it is very different for each species. Mature seeds are dry, they're darker in color, they're firm, they could be brown, black, tan, or gray in color. For example, the milkweed seeds, I don't touch them until the seed pods actually open up. I know like some of them may be already like blooming away. But I think this is a good indicator. Basically, the plant knows best when it is time to open up the seed pods, so these actually can send all these little seeds to get planted elsewhere. So once you know, when possible and when we have multiple plants, try to collect seeds from different plants, not just from one, so you preserve the genetic diversity, and so you have a better chance for you know, for the seed germination. And do not deplete the seed bank, so take no more than 20% of the available seeds. We don't really need a lot of seeds generally, especially if you're just trying to do it for our own backyards. We just need a little bit of seeds. So store the seeds as soon as we pick them up. They should be spread out and dried immediately after collection. Even if it is on a dry and sunny day, don't assume that seeds are dry. The best way is just to spread them in like cardboard boxes or trays, and do not leave in direct sunlight or extreme temperatures. I dry my out in the garage. So these are black-eyed Susan seed heads, and the black tiny seeds are actually on the bottom, so they're very, very small. But I normally just cut the seed head. There are different methods. I was recently shown of how to best just pick up the milkweed seed, just because it takes so long for just to clean the fluff after. But sometimes we just cut the whole seed head, just because if we try to collect, for example, tiny seeds like the black-eyed Susan seeds, we will lose half of them on the ground. So I just cut some of the seed heads, and then I try to collect the seeds only in my paper bag. So here it is. Once they're dry, I normally leave them, they say a few days. I normally leave them at least a week. They should be cleaned from plant debris when possible and stored. I love my paper bags. I know glass jars are a good option. Always good to have some air circulating, once again, just to avoid if there is any moisture left, just to avoid molding. Label and keep detailed notes, species name, date collected, location, and again, leave in a dry, cool, dark place until ready to plant. Or unless some of the seeds need stratification, but we'll do a whole new talk about seed stratification probably later in the season. So here is a topic that I know there is so much going on about leaving the leaves, and leaves are not litter, and how much can we leave and where, and so here is my my take on leave the leaves. Yes, they are not litter, they belong to nature. I do leave some of the leaves in my pollinator gardens for sure. They provide a place for beneficial insects to overwinter. not only to insects, to be honest. There may be some toads and frogs. There may be salamanders. They may be even like voles and mice. They do provide a place for wildlife, and people sometimes do get scared of that. I always say, if we have the diversity in our backyards, nature knows it's best of how to naturally control the populations of different species, so we don't have them start looking to go inside our house and look for shelter. Leaves left on the ground, they reduce evapotranspiration from the soil, so they keep the soil moist. They provide additional insulation for plants against freezing temperatures, and they add additional nutrients and improve soil structure after they decompose. I know people would say you leave your leaves and you're actually adding nutrition to your soil. People often don't realize that decomposition of the leaves takes a long time, usually more than 5-6 months. Ideally, they say 1 to 2 years until these leaves are fully decomposed. Again, it really depends on a number of factors such as moisture and type of leaves, but they actually sometimes even use some of the nitrogen that exists in the soil, and the fungi that actually is the primary the primary organism that breaks down the leaves and turns it back into soil. It uses some of the nitrogen that is already in the soil in order to go through the process of decomposition. Once these leaves are actually decomposed, they do add additional nitrogen, additional nutrients to the soil. But this doesn't happen overnight. However, they do improve soil structure. So this is very different from the composition of the soil. Some research shows that lawns are also benefit from a thin layer of leaves. And we're going to talk in a little bit of shredded or not shredded. Yet I wouldn't leave a whole pile of leaves on my lawn. If I would like to see that lawn, ideally I would like to get rid of it, but that takes a lot of work, so I'm just trying to do it gradually. So a thin layer, and again, lots of different opinions about how thin of a layer. I normally in my garden beds leave about 3, 4, 5 inches and thinner on my lawn, and I don't hesitate to go with the lawnmower on top of some of the leaves and skip the last mow. So whatever, actually, if there are whole leaves at the end, I just leave them there, but just not piles of leaves. So things you may want to consider. So do not pile leaves against stems and trunks. So especially whole leaves, they do contain moisture. So if we really leave a big pile of leaves touching stems and trunks, that would contribute to a good environment for moths and probably some pests. So try exactly like mulching, like we're not piling thick layers of mulch and leaves, even in our gardens, because it does suffocate the roots of the plants, and actually it may prevent rainwater going into the soil, and as well as sunlight. So thick layers of leaves may also act as physical barrier to seedlings emergence in the early spring for some of these seedlings that decide to emerge a bit earlier, or some of the early spring flowers. We should also avoid certain leaves such as black walnut and butternut, as they do contain a chemical called juglone that can add some toxicity to the soil. So these should be avoided. Another question, and we had, I had an interesting question and a conversation about oak leaves and pine needles. I've always been curious about these pine needles because we often see them in the city mulch that we use sometimes for our tree planting and our public pollinator gardens. It is a myth that actually pine needles would make your soil very acidic. However, pine needles and oak leaves, they decompose slower than some of the other leaves, such as maple leaves, for example. Due to the coating, first of all, it's a waxy coating on the pine needles, and it's a bit of a like leathery coating on the oak leaves. Also, the content of tannins, so they do decompose even slower than some of the other leaves. So if you're looking for, if you're trying to add some of these leaves, you can still use them. However, just keep in mind that it may take much longer until they're broken down. Both leaves are actually acidic when they're green, when they're fresh, but they do not change the pH of the soil, as decomposing organisms actually neutralize them. Changing of the soil, of the pH of the soil, it really requires a lot of work. If we add some of these needles and leaves, and then we add additional acidifiers such as sulfur, that's a totally different thing. It will just speed out the process, and we can make it the soil a little bit more acidic. However, we need repeated applications of that. Changing the pH of the soil is not easy, and it is really predetermined by the bedrock. And of course, like as I mentioned at the start, a lot of other factors play a role in the pH. But don't be afraid to use these. Also, I'll just give you an example. I pulled out these numbers because pine needles may have, the green needles may have a pH of between 3.2 and 3.8. The pH, which is quite acidic, the neutral is 7. But once they turn yellow, their pH actually is around 6. So they're, even before starting breaking down and being added as part of your soil, they are already not acidic at all. And the ideal pH for most plants is about 6.5 anyways. Like too alkaline is not good either. Not a problem if you would like to use those leaves. Once again, they may be it will just take slower for them to break down. So if you don't want to, if you put them in your composter, that would be okay. Whole leaves or shredded leaves. So shredded leaves, they decompose faster for sure. They allow more sunlight and water to penetrate. However, shredding destroys beneficial insect larvae. So some of these larvae even are already on the leaves before the leaves are on the ground. So shredding them, we are actually absolutely destroying these little creatures. So whole leaves hold more air pockets. They provide a perfect habitat for many tiny creatures. However, thick layers of these whole leaves may actually, as I said, intercept the rainfall or block sunlight. So not the best idea. Like I was just looking at my garden now, and I did include a number of photos at the end of the presentation. There is a lot of green foliage. So when we have these leaves, it means that the plants are still making their own food. So if we're trying to really pile all these piles of leaves, because I can see the leaves are all already falling on the ground, we don't want to cover any of the green foliage just because the plants are still busy making their own food. They're still not dormant. So we don't want to block sunlight. We may use some, again, just try not to put a huge pile of leaves on top of your plants. If you really would like to make use of your leaves, once again, rather than just put your leaves at the curb, and then go and drive to the landfill just to pick up compost. Just reduce your footprint, use what you have, just less resources, less energy. Then you can just make your leaf mold with the excessive leaves that you're not putting as whole leaves in your garden, or the leaves that are not on your lawn and that you decide to shred probably at some point. But let's say you have a lot of leaves, you would like to make use of them and turn them into compost. This is called leaf mold. A lot of gardeners use leaf mold even for their vegetable garden. I do put some of my leaves, I bury them in my vegetable garden just because they do get blown away by the wind otherwise, but that's another good thing. Once again, when I'm starting to turn the soil and plant my vegetable seedlings in the spring, they're not necessarily entirely decomposed, but they're still there. They provide a place for all these beneficial insects and decomposers, so they're great to have in your vegetable garden. But leaf mold, I do have a short video for how to make leaf mold. So when turned into leaf compost, it can add nutrients to your soil. Once again, once it is turned, it is broken down, it does add some nutrients and increases the ability to retain water, improves soil structure. So I'm just gonna start that video.
I used to think PTSD was just a part of the job, but no.
All right, so going back to the presentation. I would actually avoid the plastic bags just because they do end up in the landfill. Some people use the paper bags. Again, they decompose slowly. So I think the one shown on the picture is the most sustainable way if you decide to go with the leaf mold. A few other things that I love doing and just checking in the fall months, just adding, if not there already, some sticks, some broken branches, some rotting logs. They are a whole miniature ecosystem on their own. And rotting logs, they serve multiple functions. It is really fascinating. The first thing that actually starts growing are the mosses and lichens, and they actually prevent moisture being trapped in these logs. Then the fungi starts, you know, eating through the microcellular components of the plant. They're called lignin and cellulose, but I'm not going to go into much detail. But then they soften the wood and they make a space for larger creatures, such as the sow bugs that are crustaceans. So after that, for even larger such as the millipedes, the beetle tunnels are there. We have the whole colony of ants. And at the end, we have like the top predator, like such as centipedes. So it's like, it's really fascinating. And we say the beginning is the end when we look at decomposers, just because it slowly, again, it decomposes and it goes back to the soil. That being said, once again, they say it takes hundreds of years for an inch of topsoil to be made in the wild, let alone in our backyards. However, by putting some of these, or even like leaving some of these broken stems and logs if they fall, or if they're already in our backyard, they serve as an overwintering spot for many insects and other small animals, and they provide food for plants and animals. Some butterflies, such as the swallowtail, attaches the chrysalises to stems. So the chrysalis is actually maybe overwintering on a dry stem. So it is a great thing to have. Once again, you can even, if you have a little bit of more space, you can even bury it a little bit in the soil. Or if it just falls, the one here, it just fell off my silver maple tree. And I normally just take these and put them in my gardens. Leaf patches of bare earth for bees, something that probably I should focus a little bit more. This picture was not taken in my backyard. Once again, we try to fill in every spot so we can avoid all the weeds, but around 70% of all species of bees worldwide nest underground. And just some statistic that there are over 800 native species of bees in Canada, and 400 of which are found in Ontario. A lot of the solitary bee females, they build their own individual nests, and very often they would prefer to burrow themselves in soft soil. So soft sandy soil is often a preferable nesting site. So if we can have a little bit of that, we are all already helping out these creatures to have to be able to overwinter safely. Do not cut and clean in the fall. Once again, this is a huge shift. I see more and more gardens actually being left like that. Birds love feeding on the seeds and berries during the winter. We already talked about the larvae, that it may be on the stems, on the leaves. But think about the birds, and when cutting, you may be removing so many of these little creatures already and just putting them in the compost. If you decide to cut your plants in the spring, wait until later spring. Do so later in the spring and leave at least 1 foot of the stems. Don't actually completely dry, like remove every single dry stems, because they'll be needed later on, even when we have those butterflies and these chrysalises. They love these sticks and they try to hide them, to hide the chrysalises. So sticks are great to have. It is always the question when. My rule of thumb, when I really start seeing these bees and butterflies emerging in the spring, so this is a sign, okay, so maybe they're waking up, so maybe I can just remove a little bit of the dry branches and sticks. And I still love leaving some of the seed hats, even in the summer time. I love the bee balm, the black-eyed Susan seed hats. They just look fabulous even when they're dry. No leaf blowers. That's, I think, it's harmful for insects, for plants, for lawns, for wildlife. It's harmful for us. They blow chemicals, fungi, spores, animal fecal matter, motes, diesel soot, allergens, and other toxic substances. The use of leaf blowers actually erodes the topsoil over time, and they're causing significant air noise pollution, especially the gas leaf blowers. I've been offered leaf blowers by my neighbors many times. I don't love leaf blowers. I don't own one. If I really need to clean some of these leaves, I do rake some of the leaves, and I'm trying to be as gentle as possible. So I'm not harming creatures. I'm not blowing away a whole world of insects. So yeah, no leaf blowers. Think about trees and shrubs as part of our pollinator garden. They're an important really part. Many native trees and shrubs, they support birds, moths, and butterflies. I know they're not as showy sometimes as some of the flowers, but many insects overwinter in and under tree bark during their larval stage. Some great species to have in your backyard can be oaks if you have space, or cherries, maples. Smaller species are dogwood, serviceberry, blackberries. Great species to have in your pollinator garden or just in your yard. Something that I've been learning a lot through my certification and just as a personal interest is pruning. So pruning should be done in the early spring before new leaves appear. I know if you have dry, again, dead branches, you can remove them at any time. However, if you would like to structurally prune your tree or your shrub, you may do so when the leaves are already in the ground. So I'm talking about late November. However, the tree would not be actually to heal. Pruning is actually injuring. So it is necessary for various reasons. However, the tree is not necessarily capable of always healing these cuts, especially when they're not done properly. And there is a higher risk of pathogens entering the tree or the shrub when we prune in the fall, just because the tree is actually going into dormancy. So it's saving all the sugars, all the reserves. It's just slowing down. In the springtime, when you prune, already the sap is flowing, so the tree would use some of the energy for a process that is called compartmentalization, which is like releasing a chemical barrier around the cut. So it blocks any pathogens, any viruses, any bacteria, any fungus that is trying to enter that open wound and potentially harming your tree. We can do another talk about pruning if you're interested. However, pruning ideally should be done early in the spring. Probably whenever there is no frost, of course, on the ground, when it's doable. So aiming for a 4-season all-inclusive, keep these creatures in mind, all 4 seasons. So learn more about the life cycle of pollinators, because we may have these monarch butterflies being photographed all the time. They're beautiful, they're fascinating. Their migration journey is really, really amazing. However, we have a lot of our pollinator species that do overwinter in one form or another. Seasonal needs, food and water sources for pollinators, nesting overwintering location, minimizing any harms that we may do to these creatures. So once again, that's my backyard this summer. Other tips, I mentioned that, but I would like to say it again. Do not mulch heavily. Basically, killing with kindness. Mulch is amazing. Leaves are amazing. Just be very mindful of how much you pile, and if you're really touching the stems and the trunks. Skip the last mow. Once again, we may have these little larvae already in the grass on the lawn, so maybe it's not gonna really harm if we skip the last mow. mimic nature as much as possible. So I'm learning a lot from various resources and books, but I love learning from nature. It's my best teacher ever for many, many things. So I'm always trying to imagine if we have two different habitats and we are trying to mimic these habitats in our backyards. I don't necessarily have a huge woodlot close to my backyard. I have a lot of cedar trees and a few other trees, but so if you have an open field of wildflowers, you're not gonna get huge piles of leaves to be able to decompose within these wildflowers. Maybe you get some blown away from the nearby woodlot. I took this picture recently in North Oakville, and it made me think a lot about that. So how much of these leaves that are close to the field of evening primrose, it was actually spectacular. How many of these leaves are actually going to end up in the field? Not really piles and piles of leaves. So mimic nature as much as possible. Try to learn from nature and try to get educated how actually nature takes care of itself, because it is really a very sustainable way, and we have so much to learn. So I'm actually very excited because hopefully I'll have the chance to teach school age students, a program called biomimicry, which is basically using nature, learning from nature to solve complex human challenges. So here is one, just let's try to learn from nature. No chemical fertilizers or pesticides. And early fall is a great planting season. So you can plant your pollinators, you can plant your trees in early fall. That's a great planting season. So before I leave some, I know we don't have a lot of time, just a few slides of, so here is just different corners of my front and backyard. I still find it looks beautiful with all the shades of fall, but if you're not inspired enough, and I don't have a big backyard, so here are just some photos that I took over the past couple of summers. I have a lot, but anyway, so this is, I hope this is an inspiration for everyone, that once you invite all these pollinators, and you feel very hopeful and you feel very inspired to do more. So just for the sake of time, I would like just to